no war, either in Europe or the Middle East, breaks out before early next year. The problem is that the dots are so lining up that the war in Europe can very easily spill over Ukraine's borders into other countries, as NATO, Washington, and London have already made decisions. So we hear, in fact, back in second half of 2023, that an attack will be launched on Russia. Then if you look at what's happening in Israel, there are these rumors going around that Netanyahu has asked his defense minister to resign because he does not support a larger war against Hezbollah. One of the many issues, should that happen, is that there is only a 2 to 3 week time frame when the Air Force would be able to support any ground invasion because of weather conditions. So I made that comment before appreciating fully that the risk of war is very imminent. So if war does break out, you can forget that forecast, because immediately, with a global economy that's pretty fragile, it would sink quickly. Equity markets would correct very sharply. Metal prices will fall sharply, and the whole world would be in disarray. And in a war scenario like that, rightly or wrongly, the dollar would rise sharply. So all of the war changes upside down the economic and financial structure. If there is no such escalation of the conflicts, then markets will be driven higher, rightly or wrongly, by the Fed and other central banks cutting rates. Although one has to add that in nearly every case when rates start to be cut, they're cut because the economy is in recession or is about to fall into recession. The driving force in everything is geopolitics. And you have to ask the question, why is Washington and London so intent on attacking Russia and containing China? It's really because those two countries are the leading members of BRICS and SCO, Shanghai Cooperative Organization. And Washington, having at first dismissed BRICS as being anything of significance, now understands fully that if the BRICS summit is allowed to take place in October, when there will be a number of announcements made that will show how mature BRICS has become, and that they are accelerating their development of their own unit currency, which will be based on, as we understand it, 40% gold, 60% member currencies, but those member currencies linked back into gold. That would be a big stab into America and its allies. I think gold's rise is much less to do with the Fed cutting rates and much more a reflection of geopolitical tensions. And it's not just central banks that are adding to their gold reserves for this reason, but increasingly financial institutions. And it's the power of gold buying has been outside the G20 countries, Middle East, Asia, Russia, China. Don't forget that China's public owns something around 25,000 tons of gold. And Chinese ministries, not just the central bank, but mostly the PLA, own something around another 25,000 tons. I mean, in the last 6 months, Chinese government has encouraged its citizens to buy gold by providing a platform that allows them from their bank accounts to buy physical gold from the Shanghai Gold Exchange, even on a never-never basis. So my guess, and it's probably tied into the new BRICS currency, which I believe is called the unit, the currency unit, that China will announce within 2 years that their currency is supported by the gold which its citizens own. And I think they'll give out the figure. But what does that do to the dollar? And also Russia owns much more than is publicized. It's probably north of 12,000 tons. I think the powers behind the throne will use everything and anything to prevent Donald Trump from getting into the White House. Because if he does, and probably having RFK as his attorney general, all of these, whatever you like to call them, neocons, deep state guys, around 5,000 of them, in Washington will be all out on their ears. And that will be the end of their decades-long dream of global domination, dismembering Russia, containing China. I think that opinions are so forcibly being expressed by both sides that the likelihood of whether it's civil war or civil strife or breaking out is very real. I think the same is true across Europe, and particularly in the UK. I think there's a real risk that we will soon see the army patrolling the streets, and within 2 to 3 years there will be a national government. The question then is, who runs the national government? But if you've got the army patrolling the streets, it's an easy step forward to say the generals will control the national government, which will probably be a very good thing. But that said, it will, in the immediate future, would cause huge unrest, crisis. Then if you look at Europe, the European population in Western Europe doesn't want their governments. And then if you look at history, every revolution in Europe has been caused by the peasants, today's farmers. And it's the farmers who've started the rebelling against not just their own government, but against Brussels. So add on to that the fragile financial situation in Europe, the level of debt, etc. War is one way out. Who else is going to call the shots in a national government? Who are the strong people? I'm not saying the generals will be. You've got to have people like that. And if the army is patrolling the streets, it's not such a big stretch to think it would be the generals. The powers behind nearly all governments in the Western world stem from the Davos crowd. And these guys do not want the wrong story to be put out. And social media has been an avenue that they have not been able to control. But now the real information is getting out. They're getting desperate. It's across the Western world. I jokingly say, but I suspect there's an element of truth in it, that the media every evening or night gets a missive from the CIA and MI6. These are your stories for tomorrow. That's basically it. You control the media. I think the only light comes after the big crisis. I think we need the big crisis to cleanse the whole system. It's a crisis within governments and between governments. So put bluntly, it's America and its allies versus Russia and China. But I think it's quite interesting from what I'm picking up that India and China have started to mend their fences over the border dispute, and that Modi wants strong ties between India, Russia, and China, whilst trying to keep a relationship with America. But basically, I think the focus is to have these very strong ties between Russia and China, which will give added strength to the BRICS group of nations. I think Martin Armstrong is dead right. War comes back to the point I made earlier, that America and her allies are not going to allow BRICS to mature into a real rival to their system. That's the bottom line. And that inevitably means war. It will happen in a year or two's time. So if it gets postponed for whatever reason, then I think that the global economy is tipping over. By early next year, most countries will be in recession. Then all the central banks and governments will be throwing everything into the pie to stop a systemic failure. So inflation takes off, dollar falls sharply, and inflation takes off to an extent that it will probably exceed what we experienced, or some of us did, in the second half of the 70s and early 80s, 1981 being the peak in inflation. So you'll be seeing US inflation 13% plus, global inflation 15% plus. And what does that do for the bond vigilantes? Central banks don't control the long end of the curve. We will see US 10-year Treasury yielding over 10%. So if war is postponed until after that happens, which will be when we 25, 26, end 26, early 27, you will then have either rolling recessions or depression, plus war. But my fear is that war is going to happen before Inauguration Day in America in January. Let us assume no big escalation to the current conflicts at this stage. So we will probably see markets getting excited by central banks cutting interest rates, and we will see S&P rising sharply into the early months of next year, with base metal prices like copper rising to potentially over $11,000. But it is then that the real recession will start hitting. And then we will have big falls in equity markets and in base metal markets to the end of 2025. Then more liquidity is driven into the system, and you have the final hurrah, as I'd like to call it, when you have a takeoff in equity markets and takeoff in base metal markets, with copper potentially going to 14,000 and S&P over 7,000. But then we come back to what I've just said, the bond vigilantes. But the alternative scenario, which I mostly fear, which is the war scenario breaking out by the end of this year, that all changes the equation, because the world goes into not the depression in 2028, but almost immediately. First of all, to survive, you need food and water. There are some very good generating sets, particularly produced in China, powered by folding solar panels, from which you can run everything. Electricity, heating, water too is essential. In terms of your assets, gold, number one, your house, land. There's the story of the old Italian family going back centuries. Is wars were a common theme in those days. They had title to their lands, so they left in their wagons. What did they carry? Gold and art. So when the wars ended, they came back, they had their gold, they had their art, and they had title to their lands. So I think that's the sort of thing one needs to think about. There's a close friend of mine who knows Africa very well, traveled all over the place. He said, I never carried cash with me. I carried physical things because it's a barter system. Even today, he's buying X, Y, and Z from Zimbabwe, Zambia, Malawi, etc., etc., etc. No cash, physical.